Okay, well, we are on and we are live. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off because it is 1 o'clock and we do try to be timely at Ghostrock Meet the SME. So today's lecture is going to be given by Dr. Greg Mohr, who works at the Navy Nuclear Laboratory. He'll be talking about computed radiography for shipyard applications. And this is going to be, I think, very interesting, but that's my background is ships. So please, everyone, mute your speakers so that we don't have any interfering noise. Please also turn off your cameras so we don't have any distractions there. If you could, please jot your questions down and wait till the end to ask them. Or at any time, you can use the chat button below and go ahead and write it. George and I will be monitoring that for Greg while he's talking. And if we have any kind of an interruption, please hang with us. We will try to get it back. We have only had one snafu with the electronics, so I'm hoping to get through this with no problems. So Greg, without any further ado, could you give us a little bit of talk about yourself and then take it away?
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm Greg Mohr. As Karen said, today happens to be my 13th anniversary working at the Knowles Laboratory. For those of you who don't know Schenectady, New York, well, we used to joke here, we had kind of two recruiting pitches when we were trying to hire people. One of them was, it's a great place to raise kids. The other pitch was, it's 3 hours to New York City, 3 hours to Montreal, and 3 hours to Boston. So we're kind of halfway between Montreal and Boston, right on the eastern edge of New York State. So almost New England, but not quite. My background is I've been working in various bits of technology and applications of digital radiography for, well, I won't say a very long time, but since I was knee high to a grasshopper, I guess. I spent a number of years with the General Electric Company at their Global Research Center, which is also located in suburban Schenectady, New York. I did a tour at GE Inspection Technologies doing new product development for them. And like I said, I've been at the Knowles Laboratory now for 13 years. The Knowles Laboratory is part of the Naval Nuclear Laboratory. So I don't suppose you can see my little mouse floating around on the screen, but this is an organization. Our goal is to support the United States Navy. We develop and support nuclear propulsion systems that are employed on all of the aircraft carriers and submarines in the fleet. So that's what we do there. There are 5 sites, all of them owned by the Department of Energy, all of them operated by some company. This particular contract cycle, it's the Fluor Marine Propulsion LLC that's in the little letters there. So that's kind of the background. At the Knowles Laboratory, I work in a laboratory where we do radiographic examinations of something different every day. My colleagues Amy Musson and Nick Cosentino do all the heavy lifting, and I mostly just cheerlead for them. They're the real superstars. But we have a ball, and that's what we do there. So let's see if I go next slide, what happens? Perfect. Okay. So this is what I want to talk about today. So I hope to start at the beginning, and I apologize. I know that I'm going to bore some of you just terribly, but hopefully we'll get to some interesting stuff at the end. So we'll talk a little bit about what is computed radiography, what the advantages might be, how it's different from film RT, and some of the issues that occur when you actually try to use this new technology, and some of the results and standards that are important. And last but not least, we'll give a brief update on where we are implementing this in the Navy shipyards. All right, so what is computed radiography? It's one type of non-film radiography. It makes digital images. So there's others, of course. Everybody is probably familiar with computed tomography, which makes three-dimensional maps of people. And in fact, that's the picture that they're labeled digital is you can see a patient going into a medical CT scanner, that donut-shaped thing in the back. And you can see a young man looking at cross-sectional slices of what appears to be a skull on that monitor. The name computed radiography, which is one particular type of digital radiography, was invented by the folks in Japan who brought this technology to market primarily originally for the medical usage. Pretty quickly, people tried to adapt it for industrial use, and so this was back in the late 1990s that this was going on. When we do CR, we swap out the film, the X-ray film, the chemically developed film, and the device that you put it in, and the developer. And what we instead use is an imaging plate and a scanner. So in CR, a computer reads the image from the scanner and then displays it. So we'll talk more about that later, what the difference between an image and a display is. All right, how does it work? Well, the imaging plate, the IP, it uses the same exact flexible plastic substrate as conventional radiography film. But instead of having two thin photosensitive chemical layers, it has one thicker photosensitive layer with this, strange chemical barium fluorobromide, europium dope stuff, which is a phosphor. Most people are familiar with phosphors in other contexts, glow in the dark keychains, and the stars and moon stickers that you think about in children's bedrooms. Turn off the light and they continue to glow afterwards. So those are what we normally think of as phosphors. The phosphor that's used for imaging plates has some interesting capabilities. So in particular, it doesn't release its phosphor light immediately. It kind of traps the light and waits for a later event to trigger the release. So the way that works is typically a red colored laser tickles the exposed plate, and that little bit of extra energy is enough to allow the stored latent energy to be released as blue light. So there's a picture there that says readout underneath. So you can see a red laser, you can see it shining at a mirror, and you can see it being directed to the plate where blue light is given off. And then there's some interesting optics that happens and directs that blue light to a device called a photomultiplier tube. And that's a very sensitive device that measures the amount of blue light, photostimulable luminescent light, the PSL, that's emitted at each spot. So a scanner is not like a camera. The laser is only illuminating one tiny spot on the IP at a time, and the PMT is just measuring the amount of light that one tiny spot emits. And then as the laser moves around to different locations, we measure the amount of blue light coming off of different locations. Okay, so what the scanner then does is measure the electrical output of the photomultiplier tube and put together a set of pixel values that correspond to the amount of light that was being emitted at each place, which is in turn proportional to the amount of X-ray energy that was absorbed in the plate during the X-ray exposure. A computer then, scanner is typically connected to a computer by Ethernet or USB or something of that nature. And the software on the computer assembles the data that the scanner generates and stores it in an image file. And so each pixel in the image file corresponds to a particular spatial location on the imaging plate. And thus, we end up with a digital image. Now, it's important to understand that the digital image is invisible. You cannot see it. It's a bunch of, electronic ones and zeros in a computer file someplace that you can't see it with your eyes. So much like a digital camera, that makes JPEG photos, from your phone that we all use these days. Those images, those pictures are invisible and you can't see them without using special software that can interpret the information in the file and the image and display it on a screen or a monitor. So for computed radiography, we have to do exactly the same thing. We have to display the image using typically a monitor. So because we're radiography people, we typically display them as shades of gray. They don't have to be mapped that way. You can use pseudo color maps. So if you're more familiar with, ultrasonic images, the display of those, they're often done in pseudo color, and the same thing can happen here. But we usually use shades of gray to make it convenient. When we're done with the plate, when it's been scanned, typically what we do is an erasure cycle. So typically the readout from the laser does not liberate all of the stored information on the IP. So we expose it to some intense light of some sort, and that causes the rest of the image to be evaporated, if you will. So any remaining photostimulable light gets emitted, and the plate is now empty and ready for reuse. So the fundamental point here is that the IP is reusable. So unlike a X-ray film, which is normally only exposed one time and has the image permanently stored directly on the film, the IP never has a visible image on it. Only by this photostimulable luminescence process with the scanner and the laser are we able to convert the information from the X-ray exposure into an image and then display it. Okay, so why would anybody want to use CR? It looks awful complicated. I've been doing my film radiography for 40 years and I'm pretty good at it. Well, typically if you look at a sales brochure, there's 3 classes of benefits, right? Better, faster, and cheaper. So what makes CR potentially better? Well, one is that digital image data can be enhanced before it is displayed. So we don't have to change the image data, but while we're doing that mapping, that display, we can emphasize some parts of the information or de-emphasize parts that we don't care about. Because the imaging plate can store more information than can be effectively viewed at one time by human eyeballs, in many applications you get wider latitude, meaning that you can see a wider range of thicknesses or have more exposure variation without losing image quality, which in a factory or production kind of setting can reduce the number of reshoots that happen. CR can be faster. Your typical film processor takes 11 or 13 minutes to turn an unexposed film into a radiograph. The time to scan an IP can be much faster than that. It's typically a minute or a minute and a half, something of that nature. But more importantly, the developer and all its chemicals and associated stuff in the dark room typically has to, means that there has to be a dedicated facility, which is often far from where the radiographs are being exposed. So by using a laptop and a portable scanner, you can immediately see the results of the exposure and verify that everything is good before you break down the setup and go on. So sometimes there can be some pretty significant delays while you're waiting for image quality verification, and CR can help eliminate those. Okay, again, the imaging plate can be erased and reused. The imaging plates are typically noticeably more expensive than X-ray film on a per sheet basis. But if you can reuse it many times, then they can actually be cheaper. You don't have the worries about chemicals and storage and disposal and all those sorts of things. So they can be greener. And so a lot of places are interested in for those reasons. So all of these reasons, CR is, like I said, one kind of DR. The whole point is that it's now widely used in the bulk of radiography, which happens in the medical and dental and veterinary fields. So in first world countries, in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, North America, it's becoming more and more difficult to get an actual film X-ray. The majority of radiography is now done digitally. So if you go to the dentist and get your bite wing X-rays, chances are the thing that goes in your mouth is no longer a piece of film, but rather a little tiny imaging plate, an IP, or a small digital detector array, which is like a digital camera for X-rays. So in the medical world, they have arranged it so that the exact same cassettes that were used to hold and handle film between exposure and delivery, that same form factor and everything has now been replaced identically with DDAs and CR cassettes. Okay, well, it's not a one-for-one replacement, unfortunately. We all wish it was. But we do use many of the same things. So the radiation source, whether it's a tube or a linear accelerator or for field radiography, an isotope source, they're the same. You use the same sources of radiation to expose the IP as you would use to expose a piece of film. Similarly in the case of CR, you're still using cassettes, screens, filters, masking, all that sort of stuff to improve the radiographic quality. So the handling and the kind of the conceptual process for doing CR is very similar to that for doing film radiography, which makes it attractive for institutions that can be sometimes a little change averse. So when you're talking about the techniques, they're not identical, but they're at least similar. So the amount of time that's required to do an exposure is maybe not exactly the same, but roughly the same. The idea of handling, loading a cassette and putting it, doing a setup in the exposure cell or in the field, positioning the source, all those sorts of things. That whole workflow process looks very similar all through the exposure. Okay. Again, what we've done is basically we're exchanging film and a developer process. So there's a picture of a developer, and I think I got this one from the guys who make green labels on their film, and replacing it with an IP and typically a tabletop kind of scanner. And there's one there on the right that you can see. So this just for scale, this unit is roughly 30 by 30 by 15 inches in size, and they weigh, something on the order of tabletop units weigh between 100 and 150 pounds typically. They do make smaller field portable units as well. So there's a variety of these things available. Okay, so what are the real differences? Well, film is single use, but IPs can be erased and reused. So you go from one use to many uses. In the case of film, that one use results in a permanent residual image, right? You've exposed the film, it's there, and with proper storage can, last 50 or 75 years. Sometimes we don't get complete erasure of the CR, and so we end up with what's called ghosting, where tiny fraction of the previous image can be discerned in the current image. There's techniques for dealing with that, both avoiding the ghosting process in the beginning and dealing with it afterwards. The biggest change is with film, you're only going to use it once. So, I won't say that you can be grossly dirty, but it's much more forgiving than the CR process to cleanliness. Dust and dirt and scratches and fingerprints and stuff directly affect the quality and usability of a CR plate. So, to get the economics out of it, they have to be handled carefully. Sometimes that's a training issue for staff. Okay, so we've hinted at this already, but I want to talk about it a little more. The developed films both contain and present the image. It's all in one. The image and the display are the same, accomplished with the same physical radiograph. With computed radiography, we have split those two functions into two separate places and times. The digital images are invisible and have to be converted to information for display. Archiving of files and computer media is a very, very different process than managing X-ray film. I've been to film warehouses where, people have just boxes and boxes stored away, and they send them to Iron Mountain or something similar for long-term storage, or a salt mine or someplace like that. Maintaining bits is, it's an IT kind of thing. We have professional folks that, manage cloud storage. Okay, so I'll continue. The other thing is that, for large image collections, you really need database technology to be able to effectively manage large collections of images. Now that all of us have phones in our pockets and are snapping photographs all the time, it's pretty easy to imagine, that you can remember that you took a picture of Aunt Jeannie in the kitchen, Christmas last. Putting your fingers on it can be quite a challenge. So the same thing goes for, the whole business of record retention and locating and finding images. Databases really are important. The database in my laboratory, we currently have about 1.2 million digital images stored, and we can find them and locate them in minutes because they have been carefully organized into a database, searchable databases that allow us to retrieve them, just in moments. So, so far, this all sounds pretty positive. Why wasn't everybody doing this? And the answer is it's not as easy as it sounds. The upfront capital expense, buying scanners and IPs and stuff like that can be rather expensive. The I don't wouldn't want to speak for a manufacturer or a sales representative perspective, but it's many tens of thousands of dollars typically. So doing the transformation, it requires a pretty significant amount of time and effort. You know, excuse me, I'm going to make my phone go away because it's just blowing up here for some reason. The procedure development, learning how, like I said, we've already talked about some of the aspects of this. Handling, the digital records is a very different process. Dealing with the fact that images now have to be displayed instead of just held up to a light box. We're talking about computers and training and all sorts of stuff. So procedures have to be, for all the new steps in this process have to be developed and vetted. We talked a little bit about the need for careful controls for the handling of IPs to ensure an economically long lifetime. Techniques are not identical. They vary for a number of reasons. So, you can't just expose an IP exactly the same way as you would a film. Typically, those results are less than satisfactory. And last, with anything new, there's a whole lot of personnel training and certification, on the job practice. To be fully transparent, digital images just look a little different than film images, which makes operators and interpreters sometimes very uncomfortable. They require a fair amount of exposure to become comfortable with the fact that they're seeing the same kinds of indications in their radiographs. They just appear a little different, a little grainier, a little blockier, but still there. One of the big stumbling blocks is IT support. These days with computer security and viruses and things running rampant in the world, organizations tend to be very conservative when adding new technology to their networks. But unfortunately, it is required because intrinsically we are dealing with computers and computer data. The other thing is sometimes people just assume that they're going to throw away their film in their dark room and replace it with an IP scanner and a collection of IPs and just overnight flip the switch and all of their film radiography processes are going to go away. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. There will always, I think, in my humble opinion, there will be some applications that just require specialty films, particularly very tight space applications where you have to roll up a piece of film and stick it inside a structural member on a C5 or other very tight space applications where it's just very difficult to get multiple uses because limited flexibility of the IP. So kind of the takeaway here is that the person who typically gets tasked to do this in an organization is the level 3 or the NDT examiner. And sometimes they don't have the experience and skill set that's needed to be a multifaceted project manager and juggle all this stuff and, oh, by the way, still get production out the door. So that can be a challenge for level 3s. Okay, so why are the techniques different? The first reason is that the absorbing layer, the photosensitive layer on the IP, is thicker than the photosensitive layers on a film. Okay. So what that does is make IPs relatively more sensitive to soft, low KV kind of X-rays. All right. Scattered X-rays are lower energy than transmitted X-rays in a radiography setup. So one of the things that happens is you can be more sensitive to scatter than you would be with a conventional film exposure. So what that means is screens have to be typically adapted. Sometimes you can use the same screens, but sometimes you need thicker LEDs. Sometimes you need copper or iron screens in addition to LED screens. And it takes a little bit of practice and intuition to make all that stuff happen. Second is the spatial resolution can be slightly worse. We talked about how these things, we capture the X-rays and then we shine light at it and light comes back out. Well, that light has a tendency to go in sideways directions as well as directly toward the photomultiplier tube. And so you get a little bit bouncing around inside the IP layer itself, and that can cause a little bit of resolution loss. The other thing that can happen is that because these guys are intrinsically reusable, it can reduce the amount of dynamic range that's available. If you just overexpose a plain X-ray film drastically, at some point the areas that were exposed directly just get black and are, essentially opaque. The corresponding thing that can happen with these other guys is that you got a huge signal coming from the open air part of the radiograph. It can cause issues with the scanner that kind of blind it, sort of like night blindness when you're driving in a car and somebody comes at you and doesn't turn off their high beams. Your eyes kind of take a minute to recover. Well, the IP scanners will do the same thing. So all of these issues mean that you may need to change the KV up or down, add masking, sometimes even tube filtering. Unlike film, the other thing that is different is that the exposure dose doesn't have the same kind of optical density requirements that you typically have in film radiography. So there's typically some requirement that your optical density, your film has to be between 1.5 and 4, or something of that nature. When we're doing any of the digital radiographies, the thing that kind of substitutes for optical density is pixel value. So the numbers that are stored in the computer for each physical location of the image. But they don't work in exactly the same way. So there's typically not a limit for sensitivity, but rather there are limits for saturation and insufficient signal to noise and contrast. So there's still typically a range of usable pixel values, but the criteria that are used to determine it are quite different. So the other thing that can happen is that in some applications, the required exposure to get the required sensitivity can be much, much faster than for film. So one of the classic examples is doing pipeline inspections out in extreme conditions. So I'm thinking about the Alaska pipeline where they, it's cold and, they're going out, but they're looking for erosion corrosion on a big pipe. Turns out that CR is just really well suited for that particular application. You don't require great sensitivity. You don't require, exquisite spatial resolution. You're just looking for missing, big patches of missing material. And you can typically do those kinds of exposures much faster than the corresponding film exposures. But sometimes the opposite is also true. For some applications, and particularly I'm thinking about weld inspections here, they can actually require more dose to achieve adequate image quality. So, depending upon the product and inspection mix that you're dealing with, just learning how to do technique development can be challenging in and of itself. Okay, so we've decided we're going to bite the bullet and start to go down the CR path. There are a number of good resources for learning how to do this more effectively. The the ASNT puts out two good references. CP 105 has a list of training curricula that are specifically call out digital radiography. So that's a good resource of some of the things that people should learn. And then CP 189 gives some suggested number of hours for classroom training and for on-the-job training, specifically looking at and interpreting digital images because they do look different than film. The European Standards Committee has a number of documents as well that are quite prescriptive in terms of technology use and implementation. The American Society for Testing of Materials, ASTM International, has four standards in particular. E2007 is a guide, kind of a tutorial thing. It's undergoing revision right now. The next version of it that comes out, hopefully in the next couple of years, should be significantly modernized from the current one, but the current one's not bad. There's a standard practice which talks about how to do radiography using CR. And there are two other documents. The 2446 document is intended to provide a comparison basis for the different CR systems and IP types. E2445 is intended for use by users to verify the ongoing suitability and performance of their equipment, make sure that things aren't slipping behind the scenes. ASME, the boiler, I don't know if it's my network connection or what. I'm sorry, very sorry. But I'll make sure that the microphone's very close here. Hopefully that'll help. All of the nuclear yards are working on technique development. Excuse me. NAVC has established a program for qualifying what they call level 3s, the NDT examiner program. So that's operational. A number of people have successfully passed that exam and are qualified as NDT examiners in computed radiography now. One of the shipyards has a history of using CR primarily for welder qualification testing. So that's been ongoing for a number of years. All of the shipyards have suffered from IT-related project management kind of issues. All of the IT organizations are very conservative and slow to change. So there's been a lot of issues related to that. They're actively doing studies for developing techniques for, excuse me, particularly welding. Data archives, the databases that we talked about have been installed now at 2 of the nuclear shipyards. And I am assured that Kelly Sawyer down at Norfolk Naval Shipyard will be turning in her submission for doing this very soon. She's just waiting on final approvals right now. So she's done a great job of pulling this all together, and we're all excited to see that be adjudicated. Okay, I think I'm done and ready for questions. I apologize for my sound going in and out. But I'll open it up, and how to let you help me moderate this, Karen.
Okay, note to self, unmute before I start talking. So Greg, could you please go back a couple of slides? When you started talking, one more. Right there. Could you go back and repeat what you were saying about, you started cutting out at about the Daikonde guide?
Oh, okay. So Daikonde is a standard that is based on the medical practice for handling digital images. That standard is known as DICOM and is now universal and ubiquitous. Every medical device that makes digital images now in the world conforms to the DICOM standard, and it's extremely detailed in terms of data formats and metadata requirements and things like that. ASTM took over adapting that standard for industrial use, and has now promulgated a number of standards which most of the manufacturers are more or less compliant with. E3169 is, again, a tutorial guide which talks about why you would want to use the Daikonde framework for building databases for image management. Is that enough, Karen, or more?
And then the rest, we didn't get any of the rest down there.
Oh, okay. Boiler code, ASME boiler code has a whole section on how to use CR, great gory detail. The Navy welding standard for the nuclear side is 250-1500. The general NDT method, TP271, that NAVCO5 does for the rest of the ship applications, has an appendix for one specific application, again, pipe erosion and corrosion tangential radiography using CR. So that's in there. The NAVC folks who are responsible for TP271 are doing a fast follow to implement the same kinds of controls that are in the 250-1500 standard.
Thank you.
Okay, did this one come through okay?
No.
Okay, we'll do it again. Faster, hopefully. So 250-1500 now allows CR to be used for RT inspections with approval. 3 submissions are required, one for the procedure, the training and process control and quality assurance kinds of things. One for the specific techniques that are being used to inspect specific items. And last one, a different submission on how one goes about handling this digital data and doing record retention and all that sort of stuff. So 3 submissions are required. We've published checklists to kind of help provide a roadmap for submitters so that they can understand the expectations and what's being asked of them. And then last but not least, I want to emphasize that demonstration of sensitivity is required, preferably with RQIs, showing that discontinuities smaller than those of critical defect size can be reliably detected. Last point is that, as at least when you're getting started, you have to get everything approved, check, check, check. But the intent is that after a while, your organization has established a track record that having everything individually approved can be waived.
Okay, so the one question that I have that are you seeing any kind of a trend, or is there the digital data management? I keep getting stuck on the fact that computers are, changing rapidly. I just replaced my personal computer because the other one was 10 years old and there was just no way the data could be readable anymore. And I'm talking about, small files. The CR files are huge. So when we're talking about some of these systems in the nuclear world or some of the other fleets, we're talking about we have to keep these data, these images for up to 50, 60 years. Well, how do we plan on having those readable in 50 and 60 years? Is anybody thinking about that? Do you know of?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. That's part of that whole data management plan, is how does one do this? So first thing I'll say, Karen, is that organizations manage large collections of data very differently than individuals manage their small collections, right? You and I think about making CDs or DVDs or thumb drives or something to store our files. And because we are reliant on small media, obsolescence becomes an issue. Big organizations manage their data quite differently. And, think of the cloud, right? Google doesn't lose data. Google remembers everything that we see in every embarrassing picture that we've ever posted. So institutional stuff is done differently. So that's one point. The other one is that the DICOM or DICONDI framework provides a robust and reliable and backwards compatible method for storing and retrieving image data. So the use of DICOM or DICONDI is really vital for that long-term accessibility.
Okay, thank you. And what about flat panel detectors?
Well, before I expound on that, are there any other questions? Does anybody else have any? Is there anything in the chat?
I've been monitoring the chat and haven't seen any questions. I did ask folks to, put in the chat if they'd like. And actually, people want to just unmute themselves and ask the question directly. That, we're trying to be informal here, so. I guess no other questions. So DDAs, what do you think?
Okay, so
Yeah, we're gonna be
DDAs,
able
all
to,
right.
we're gonna be able to roll them up and stick them inside a piece of pipe, or
Well, I was pleased to see bendable DDAs being advertised at the ASNT Fall Conference in Nashville. So, traditionally the DDAs have been made in one of two ways. The smaller devices were crystal silicon crystalline silicon, which is a brittle material, but the same kind of stuff that are all the integrated circuits that power our lives and computers use. The other process for the larger scale devices was to deposit um, semiconductor devices based on an amorphous silicon technology onto a glass substrate. And again, glass is not flexible. So people have been experimenting with depositing the electronic layers that are necessary to make a DDA device onto flexible substrates for some time. And like I said, the first commercially available devices are out there now. And I wouldn't say that they were as nearly as flexible as a piece of film, but I saw devices being subjected to a radius of curvature that is maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 inches, something like that. So moderately flexible. Presumably that will only increase in the future. The second thing I'd say about DDAs is they have one really significant advantage over computed radiography. Computed radiography, you have one shot, if you will, one exposure per read, and that's it. So the amount of dose that you can take is limited by the dynamic range of the device. Digital radiography has, like I said, significant advantage that you can do frame averaging. You can just sit there and accumulate and average the data and basically get as large a dose as you want. The DDAs tend to be more intrinsically sensitive than the CR devices because the phosphor or scintillator materials are much more intimate contact with the photoreceptors, so the photon efficiency is better. So they tend to be more sensitive intrinsically, and they can frame average. And the net result is that sometimes you struggle to get image quality with a CR imaging plate. With a DDA, it's pretty hard to not get image quality. They're really very easy to use. So my guess is that, they obviously have all the same issues with data management and display and things like that, any of that's inherent in all the digitals. But I would assume that if you were interested in asking for permission to use a DDA, that if you met all the CR requirements, it would be forthcoming.
So, everything sounds so simple when you walk through it like this and you explain it. But what actually is, this has been years, if not decades, that the NAVC side of the house has been struggling with getting CR in an actual production usable modality. What do you see as the biggest drawback or roadblock, I should say?
Well, I think it took a long time for the Navy side to come up with useful standards that would help the practitioners get over the hump. I think it's too complicated without some kind of guidelines in place to expect somebody to be successful. And again, I don't mean to disparage my level 3 colleagues because I'm in awe of the work that they do. But, again, project management isn't always their forte, and instituting this stuff can be difficult. So I think the lack of standards for a long time was the big roadblock. Now that we've kind of gotten past that, people are getting serious about using it. I'm going to throw Kelly under the bus here. Kelly came into this roughly a year ago with, and she was given a mandate to go make this happen. And it's taken her better part of a year. She's been working on this more or less nonstop. So, coming up from scratch, it's a significant effort. So, one thing is she had the advantage that she was more or less a dedicated resource working on this project. So I have no doubt she'll be successful. But, the other thing is, production pressures. Most of the level 3s have, pretty serious need to get stuff done and inspected and out the door. And typically those pressures don't go away, to conduct a project of the scale of a CR implementation.
Yes, it's very challenging. I agree. Well, Greg, there's no other questions that I'm seeing coming through. So as I told you earlier, I will be editing this presentation, and everyone online, we do have permission to post it. So in the next couple of days, I'll be putting it up on the Ghostrock Ask the SME YouTube site. So letting everybody else know where they can find it. And the information from Greg was not only very informative, but it also shed some light on everybody that's struggling with this, that they're definitely not alone. And there are people that can be reached out to help get it together.
Yeah. So I guess the other thing I would invite everybody to do is, if they don't know me personally, don't have my contact information, if you have questions or comments, particularly feedback about my long and boring presentation style today, please forward those to Karen, and she will share them gently, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Very gently.
I thought your presentation style was quite good. Actually, sorry about my camera here. That's what I was using that to learn from. You're very precise with your words, and I was able to follow everything quite easily because you do a very good job of communicating. So thanks for that.
So once again, thank you so much, Greg. I'm sure there'll be other things come up in the future that we'll be asking for help. You are one of the experts in this field. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and talk with this group and share your knowledge. And it's all about helping out everybody else in the community of NDT to get better professionally and in our knowledge levels. So I really appreciate it. And like I said earlier, be looking for this on the Ghostrock Meet the SME talks. So.
All right, good. All right, well, edit it up nice and take out all my ums and ahs, please. Okay.
I will edit it to where you look brilliant.
Thank you so much for that. All right. Thanks, everybody, for your time. I appreciate everybody's time and attention here today.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.